Volume 2 Students' Notes Open Eyes. If eyes didn't know tears, soul wouldn't know the rainbow. Few words about poetical experiments. Slow evolution from romanticism to modernity. This is the process that I've been observing in my poetry for the last 4 years. Sometimes I surprise myself with verbal jokes or dark visions like a previous life or dream. Sometimes I can see my romantic soul here, because romanticism is a way of looking at the world and receiving its stimuli. This volume also tells a story at the same time. It's a mosaic that is made up of 14 cycles of poems. It all was written between 2017 and 2021. Even while writing this introduction, I still create new pieces of this puzzle and fill gaps. Is this the poetical story of my life? Maybe it's a bit like that. Everyone needs to process the past and present to keep on moving forward. Sharing your feelings through poetry is a very important thing. Not everyone can find the right words, but everyone needs purification. That's why I'm always happy when someone tells me, "Thank you, that's what I needed." Maybe this is also why God created poets. Open eyes is a process that costs a lot of energy. Learning is something that must be the priority to become a mature person. Sometimes it takes an incredibly long time to become a completely new person and see a whole new reality. This is what this poetry book is about: changing consciousness and looking for new paths. Life is a never-ending journey. That's why the whole book begins and ends with the same theme, framing device. The first cycle, Romantic Summer, is a continuation of Love, Pain, and Other Addictions. It was inspired by Romanticism. Summer, Fall 2017, the longest holidays of my life. Transition period. End of high school. Beginning of studies. Work in a kindergarten as an English teacher. It means little kids learning their first foreign language. Writing poems for literary competitions. Trying to publish the first book. Love, Pain, and Philosophical Reflections. That means the title Addictions. Life itself. The second cycle, Invasion of Angels. Angel is one of the most important poems of mine. It was written in 2016. The rebellious woman angel motif was still an important metaphor to me. So I wrote more poems that make up this cycle now. A cycle that ends with salvation. I think I won't continue this storyline, but you never really know what the poet can come up with. New beginnings, the third cycle, very important. The turn of 2017 and 2018 was a difficult time to me. The first year of studies is always the most difficult, but not only that happened to me then. After 2 years of waiting, I met another piece of my soul, and about 2 weeks later, I experienced an explosion in the pre-war building where I lived, a fire. It was a huge story in my area. I was born and I live in the Praga Północ district, Praga North, in Warsaw, and this district is full of such old buildings. Once you find gas, ingenuity, and human stupidity, then not much luck is needed to create fireworks. Well, there was the explosion, there was the fire, there was the flood in the street, the happiness of surviving this catastrophe, and 6 months of stay in hotels. So now it's time for a meat grinder called poetry. September Hopes is the last accent that closes 2018, and it's also the ideological ending of new beginnings. On the one hand, unfulfilled hopes, on the other, the birth of a personality that you'd become for the next 3-4 years. It's also romantic, of course. We can break away from romanticism or plow its roots. It's already too deep in the soil. Sometimes when I write, ideas for melody naturally come up as well. That's why the next cycle is songs. Since 2019, a few of these songs have appeared in my head, so it's also a part of student notes. Please look at this title now and see its double meaning. After the poetry that can be sung, something completely new comes, a laughter, which continues to this day. I mean that the new poems from 2020 and 2021 already appear here. It's a time to experiment and move away from romanticism, but not break out. That's why the cycle is called Fun, Love, and Experiments. Poetry is one of the most intimate things. It's expressing feelings, shedding visions that represent the state of mind, and at the same time it can also be a desire to hide something this way. This is the power of motifs and symbols. Sometimes it's okay to talk directly, and sometimes it's good to escape to another world, to the world of symbols. While I'm writing this, I think about the poem By the Cup of Tea, and yes, Stanisław Wyspiański is my master, above whose dramas I currently write the master's thesis. And now romanticism comes back. The next cycle is romantics. During studies I found out that my surname has a Lithuanian origin. If that's not enough, I found out about it on the day of my 21st birthday. That's why the symbol of the lost, idealized homeland has become close to my heart. It's also funny that my first trip abroad was to Vilnius. I was 16 years old then. Speaking of traveling, after an entire year of playing with this epoch at the university, during my summer holidays I visited many places related to romantics. I was, for example, in the family estate of Zygmunt Krasiński in Opinogóra. I was also lucky to see museums related to Fryderyk Chopin. In Żelazowa Wola, where he was born, and I was in his museum in Warsaw. After every visit, Chopin was inviting me later to his salons. It was like his ghost was thankful for the memory. Only poets can understand it. Black Forest, Deep Forest, a cycle that refers to Jan Kochanowski's Czarnolas. I was there too. And that's where I wrote a trifle. The first 2 lines, that's the original core. Today I'm adding this poem a little more character. This cycle also begins with the poem Renaissance, and then I come back to the romantic themes and the forest theme, which co-creates this cycle. From Renaissance to Romanticism. That's what this is all about. These still returning antique and romantic themes. All of this is still alive in culture. So many centuries, and it's simply a legacy that will never expire. And it's also worth mentioning the bloody theme. It's not only a romantic theme, but also a reference to William Shakespeare's dramas, and the hero of one of them is the main character of the next cycle. And now sad private stuff again. Treacherous Romeo is for everyone who has ever felt betrayed in any way, whether there was a reason or not. A terrible experience, indeed. In these tough times, we just must wait for a better time and do whatever it takes to heal wounds, even if it means separation from loved ones for a few months. It's really worth doing it. And one more thing. There are many kinds of betrayal. It's worth remembering this. Some can be forgiven and forgotten, and some just can't be. Sometimes it's not worth going to the river twice, popular Polish saying, and sometimes it's the destiny to experience every emotion with one and the same human, both good and bad. Romeo is a symbol of eternal and true love, but also immaturity. And yes, all these poems were written during the pandemic. Everyone had to survive this period in some way. For me, it was writing the cycle. The next, 10th cycle, is the broken chapter. This is another pandemic accent. Let's treat it as the second part of the previously presented years 2020-2021, that is the period of the pandemic. These poems were written in June, but thematically it's a continuation of the previous cycle, so I decided to put it here, not later. Pandemic doesn't have to mean drowning in grief. Can also be a good time of jumping into art and beauty. An excellent example of it is the next cycle, A Starry Night. Theme extremely romantic, right? One of my favorites. It was created in January-February 2021, winter, which is why such a landscape is painted there for a while. The 12th cycle is one of the largest outbreaks of the experiments in this volume. 7 Days Poetry Challenge is a cycle that I wrote and published every day for 7 days. I challenge myself to write poetry every day. Sometimes I have few ideas per day, so the cycle includes more than 7 short pieces. This is also where the title comes from. The 13th cycle is prose written poetry. That means it's a poetic prose. I started writing first such pieces in February 2018, but then only the first text was written. April 2019 is the time when I wrote Sailor, and I think this one truly starts this chapter of my poetry. At the beginning I wasn't convinced about this idea, but Miłosz and Różewicz wrote such classic now poems. and it was really interesting. Then I started going through my notes, and it turned out that I've been writing things like this as well. However, we must thank classics spiritually because they made this cycle part and conclusion of this book. The last cycle is Open Eyes. You can find here a few poems that summarize this volume, but also the entire book. They seemed to be the best possible last word. Now, when all cycles have been described, I must bring up the subject of the structural experiment. This book presents the story of formulating poetry, a creative thought, painted scenes, and colors of feelings. It's a mix of many styles and genres that's supposed to inspire and outline the story much more fascinating, because poetry and art are born in life. And life is an extremely delicate and sensitive tissue, internally and externally. A romantic poem and a contemporary verbal experiment can't really go hand in hand, and I hope Once Upon a Time There Were Two Poetry Books is a good example of confirmation of this thesis, and the book made of aphorisms only, supposed to complete this poetic world, enclosed in this one book. The time of 10 years ends here, begins, and will live forevermore, because it's been saved on the paper to the delight of future generations. A poetic mosaic that forms an entirety. The mixture is also an entirety. Many books can also be an entirety. A fascinating literary past penetrates the present. It's a journey in time, and at the same time, the mixing of two worlds in front of our eyes. We people and the blood of many nations and social classes now flow in our veins. Therefore, contemporary literature, characterized by the same, it just comes from our inner worlds, not the political or social circumstances, but it can indeed be a contributing factor. Perhaps in the field of poetry and literature, it will be no longer possible to invent anything new like recycling and shifting of all kinds in the modern world. To the genres that already exist, new little things can be added that weren't there before, and maybe that should be also considered as an innovation. Maybe the structure, not the subject or the language, should begin to dominate. Or maybe always one of these three surfaces will come out to the first place, and they will keep changing their places. My poetry is also cyclical, like nature, who can commune more with essence and power and primary transformations, if not a poet. Anyways, the imitation of nature is an incredibly old principle, and has accompanied the men of art since antiquity. Here the introduction of the second volume ends and the proper reading begins. July 2021, Warsaw. This year, in this introduction, I added a few closing words and wrote more about the last cycle. Somehow, I forgot to write about it a year before. July 2022, Warsaw.